So today is the last day of my 2-week FODMaP challenge, and a FODMaP diet is created specifically for people with IBS issues like I have. And so it's all an acronym, FODMaP. It stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols, which are all different types of foods that are very easily fermentable in the gut, and when they ferment, they do a couple of different things. They either create gas, which creates swelling and can cause discomfort and can trigger IBS symptoms in people who are sensitive, or they pull water to them. So they pull water out of your colon or whatever. I think most of these symptoms happen in the colon, which again causes expansion and more discomfort and problems. In the description box below, I'll link a couple lists and sources with all the information on what foods are high FODMaP, what foods are low FODMaP. It's a pretty long list at first until you get used to it, but most of us eat a similar amount of things in our daily life. So once you figure out what things are high FODMaP in your daily diet, you can cut those out or swap in low FODMaP version. So disaccharides are like lactose, which is the sugar in any milk product. And monosaccharides are fructose, so a lot of fruits, high fructose corn syrup, certain types of veggies. And then polyols are used in a lot of sugar-free desserts, sugar-free candies especially, and they include sorbitol, mannitol, maltitol, xylitol, which are the most common ones. But you can have erythritol, which is one of the most common polyols for the keto diet and for people who are sugar-free. So erythritol is the only polyol that's still okay. And you do find polyols naturally in a lot of fruits and veggies. So again, you check the lists that I'll link below and you can see what foods specifically high FODMaP and low FODMaP. And the point of this FODMaP diet, you're supposed to do it for a minimum of 2 weeks, upwards of 6 to 8 weeks, and it's supposed to be kind of like an elimination diet. You're just supposed to do it for a short period of time, and it's supposed to give your gut a break from things that are stressing it out or that are difficult for it to digest. And so when you are lowering the stress load overall on your digestion. The hardest parts for me were the garlic, onions, and bananas. And also because it's May right now and I'm filming this. I've been doing this for like the end of April and into May, and right now we have a bunch of fruits coming into season and I can't eat most of them. So you have, part of my daily life is usually just the garlic and onion that I put in all of my savory food. Anytime I'm making something savory, there's usually garlic and onion in it. And then I like to have smoothies every day when the weather's warm, and you can have green bananas, which are just unripe bananas, not plantains, but unripe bananas, you can have those. But as soon as they get a little bit yellow, they start to become higher in FODMaPs, and especially bananas that already have like the brown speckles on them are very high FODMaP, so I can't have bananas in my smoothies. Another part that made this diet hard for me was, so on a FODMaP diet, you can't have most dairy items. You can have cheeses that are very low in lactose, so like very hard cheeses. You can have butter, that's fine, but I am really severely dairy intolerant, almost to the point where it's an allergy. And so I can't even have clarified butter. So I can't have any dairy products. I already can't have gluten or any kind of wheat product, which are also not allowed on a FODMaP diet. So that part was easier for me. I already don't have dairy in my life. I already don't have wheat in my life. I'm also intolerant to nuts and eggs right now. And this is the most severe that I've ever been with my IBS intolerances. My symptoms are at their lowest. They have been for a few months, but my intolerances are at their highest. And as long as I keep away from those foods that I'm intolerant to, I don't have any symptoms. But what that means for me is that my diet was already super limited before I started this. I already couldn't have wheat, dairy, eggs, and nuts. And now I have to cut out like a good maybe half of the fruits and veggies and herbs that I like to use in my daily diet. And so it was a very, very limiting diet for me. What I ended up doing to compensate is when you're just having such a limited variety of veggies and fruits and then a couple different grains, because there's a very limited number of grains and legumes that you can have on this diet, it gets boring, and I ended up eating more meat to make it more interesting for me. And that is something that a lot of people find hard to digest when you have IBS, is too much protein, or just animal protein in general is often it causes more symptoms for IBS. So before I started FODMaP, I had been trying to cut down on my meat. And now that I have been on FODMaP for 2 weeks, I've ended up adding more meat into my diet just to be not super bored with all my meals. I haven't seen a big difference in my symptoms, but I think that's because I've already cut out a lot of the foods that I know are problematic for me for at least a couple months. And that is, I think, the key to IBS management, is figuring out what foods cause you issues and staying away from them. In the last couple months before I started doing FODMaP, but when I had already cut out a lot of the foods that I knew I had trouble with, so I was eating no dairy, no wheat, no eggs, and no nuts. So when I was in that period, I found that I only got bloated when I would have processed foods. And I only had like minor symptoms when I would have processed. So you're already really limited on how many processed foods you can have, right? Because if you can't have dairy or wheat or eggs or nuts, there's very few processed foods you can't have. But doing FODMaP made me cut down even more on the processed foods, because a lot of sweeteners are not allowed on FODMaP. So a lot of the sugar-free sweeteners like the polyols, and then you can't have honey or agave, or I think even maple syrup isn't allowed. You can't have corn syrup. Obviously those are things you don't want to eat a lot of anyways, but I was having little bits of them in some of the processed foods, because most processed foods that are gut friendly have cut out the wheat and the dairy and the nuts and the egg. The only thing they can rely on for any kind of taste or structure is the sugar. And so a lot of those processed foods ended up having a lot of either honey or agave or some kind of quote unquote natural sweetener in it. On FODMaP, I had to cut those out. That I think has helped, because in the past the processed foods that would cause me bloating and trouble, I think were either because they were high in sugar or because they had preservatives. And just being on the low FODMaP diet and having to cut that out even more, or be even more strict with how little processed food I ate, I think that made a bit of a difference. Just my bloating, my occasional bloating. I didn't have it that often, but my occasional bloating did go down. I think it's just nice in general as a break, because it does limit you, even if you don't have my same intolerances. And so you are still eating wheat and dairy and nuts and eggs. If you go on a low FODMaP diet, I think it's still really good for you, because it gives your gut a break from a lot of processed foods that have these things in them. And then on top of that, if you're in a more severe place than I am for IBS symptoms, if you're having them as a reaction to most different foods you eat, this is great because it not only makes you cut out the two biggest IBS problem foods, which are dairy and wheat, but also makes you cut down a lot of processed foods. So doing that all at once as kind of a more extreme diet really does give your gut a break from all the foods that are really tough to digest and that you could have intolerances to. That said, I think everyone's IBS is different. I know there are some people with IBS who are 100% intolerant to high FODMaP foods. That's any high FODMaP food will give them trouble. Even if they're not like me, they don't have a specific intolerance to a group of foods. Like I can't have any nuts without having issues. And even sprouted nuts cause me problems. But there are certain nuts and legumes that are low FODMaP. And for people who have intolerances to FODMaP, high FODMaP foods, this diet is great because then they can figure out what specific foods are causing them problems, and they can figure out which nuts or legumes are low FODMaP and they can eat those. It does require a lot of planning. You have to plan out a lot of your meals at first. I'm lucky that I have a lot of free time to cook because I work from home right now, so it's been easier for me. But if you do have a day job and you're not used to meal prepping, you're gonna need to meal prep for this because it's just takes a lot of planning in advance. I am gonna continue doing a low FODMaP diet for another 2 weeks, not only to see if an extra 2 weeks gives me any more change, but also because I'm doing it as part of an emergency IBS protocol that I've been putting together. I've taken all of my favorite, most trusted sources for gut health and all the advice they give on dealing with gut issues, especially extreme food intolerances and things like that, and I've put together a 2-week like emergency elimination diet. I'm gonna try it on myself first and I'll vlog the whole thing as I go. I'll vlog at the beginning, maybe at the second week point, and then at the end, and let you guys know how it's going, if I'm feeling any better or not. And then I'm gonna make that part of a big 3-month project that I'm doing. And I'll put it up on screen right here, what my plans are. If you guys are having severe gut issues and you wanna try a FODMaP diet, I'd recommend doing it in combination with the other steps that I'm gonna do as part of my like emergency IBS protocol. I'll have that up in a few weeks, so stay tuned for that. So overall, this diet didn't make a huge change for me, but I think that's because I know what foods cause me problems and what don't from just years of experimenting. And if you are brand new to all this, if you've been having gut issues and you haven't found out what foods are giving you problems, I definitely recommend trying the low FODMaP diet, at least for the 2-week period, just to see if it helps you at all. Like I said before, I've got all the information linked in the description box if you want to see sites that go more in depth into what FODMaPs are and the different reactions you can have to the different kinds of FODMaPs. And also there are a few sites that have awesome recipe databases. They have like meal prep plans, all sorts of things to help you along. And if you want to see how my 2-week emergency IBS protocol goes, stay tuned for that. That should be out in about 2 weeks because I can't afford to go to a professional gut health specialist and have them treat me. So this is my budget version of fixing IBS, is trying to do it on my own. So I was going through the video clips and I realized I forgot to tell you guys some important stuff. So if you're going to do the FODMaP diet, one of the hardest things is replacing garlic and onion. The easiest thing to use to replace for garlic is chives, and you can either add that at the beginning of the cooking or at the very end. It's obviously not exactly the same flavor as using real garlic, but it's surprisingly close. I also find that adding extra herbs helps make up for a lack of flavor that you might have otherwise gotten from things like onions and garlic. So these past 2 weeks I used a lot of cilantro and basil. But another thing I did that helps, especially if you're doing this and you're cutting out dairy for the first time, it can be really hard to go without cheese, even though technically some cheese is allowed on a FODMaP diet. If that's the case and it's your first time going dairy free, definitely get some nutritional yeast. It is these little yellow flakes that have a very, very cheesy flavor, and especially if you mix them into sauces, like if you're making, like I made a salmon potato chowder, and usually I would want to add either some Parmesan or maybe even some cheddar into that. And if you add about a tablespoon of nutritional yeast, it really does give it that cheesy flavor. Another tip for people who are cutting out dairy for the first time on a FODMaP diet is to get cans of coconut cream or full-fat coconut milk, the kind that don't have any additives except for the ingredients should read coconut, water, and maybe a thickener like guar gum, but if you can get it without that, that's great too. Obviously you can go into almond milks and those other milks as well. If you guys have tried this diet before or are currently doing it now, please leave me a comment down below and let me know your experience. If you guys need any more resources on a low FODMaP diet, I've got all the links for that in the description box below.